Why do Russians believe in propaganda? How is it even possible in the 21st century, in the age of internet and mass media? Why can't we simply tell Russian people the truth about the war in Ukraine? I'm Alex, and today I will address these questions. First, it is important to understand what Russian propaganda really looks like. Many might think of it as a propaganda of the Third Reich, only with smartphones and internet instead of radio. Others think of it as a flow of delusional fake news that Russians somehow inexplicably believe. In reality, however, it is far more complex. Russian propaganda is a set of measures to alter reality as a whole. Admittedly, it is much more intricate and effective than Goebbels' propaganda. Let's take a look at some examples. Here are two news items.
Ukrainian President Zelensky visited the site of the execution of civilians in Liman. The Ukrainian Military Prosecutor's Office and an international team to investigate war crimes committed by the Russian army have already begun their work. To date, 14 bodies have been discovered. Putin and Biden met to discuss the division of Ukraine into two parts. According to a source close to the Russian president's administration, they agreed in a secret section of the treaty that eastern Ukraine would be annexed to Russia.
I'm sure that, unlike many viewers in Russia, you can easily distinguish between fact and fiction. It should be easy to discern which is true and which is false, since you are not exposed to the Russian propaganda and can think critically. It should be very obvious what is a lie here and what is truth, right? Well, I'm going to disappoint you. Both of these news are in fact fake. So why did you believe one but not the other? You see, I just employed several propaganda instruments to give you the experience of a typical Russian TV viewer. Let's have a closer look. Firstly, people are predisposed to trust respectable sources without verifying every piece of information. This is exactly why I created a fake authoritative publication by the BBC News. Secondly, people tend to believe information that confirms their worldview. For example, you probably heard about the war crimes of the Russian military in Bucha. If so, it's likely that you will believe other war crimes to be true, without a question. Thirdly, I drew your attention to an obvious fabrication. The news on the left appears much more credible against the backdrop of the lies on the right. It's important to understand Russian propaganda doesn't have a goal of convincing the viewer of all its claims. Its goal is to create doubt and confusion whenever possible. Fourthly, you may have been swayed by my undeserved praise when I called you a good critical thinker, pushing you to a decision. Also, the task of course was deceptive from the start, as I presented two falsehoods and asked you to choose the truth. Fifthly, there were both stories about events that occurred far away from you, in places you likely haven't visited or even heard of before. Would your response be any different if I had written Lipetsk instead of Liman, for instance? And finally, imagine this news was just one item in a stream of more relevant information flooding your feed, such as energy prices or inflation. Now consider that these fake stories have been circulating for years. You would likely have formed a very different worldview. Still, propaganda would be less effective if Putin's regime did not control access to alternative sources of information. In Russia, the state exercises direct or indirect control of all media outlets: television, newspaper, radios, even social networks and online news platforms. The agenda is in one way or another censored or even dictated by the Kremlin themselves. The internet is the freest information space, of course, although it cannot be considered truly free, with sites like Facebook, Twitter and Instagram being blocked. Shortly after the start of the war, Meta was declared an extremist organization by the Russian government. However, there are some honest independent media that can still be accessed. Yet Putin's regime has found ways to prevent them from operating too. Through license revocation, intimidation, administrative and criminal cases, searches, rackets and even murders, the regime has forced honest journalists out of the country and made it more difficult for them to operate from abroad. For an independent media outlet to be successful, it must of course be commercially viable. If Putin's regime cannot put pressure on journalists personally, it targets advertisers. To this end, legislation was drawn up to label dissenting media as foreign agents, unwanted organizations, and even extremists, in turn cutting them off from monetization and advertising revenue. Okay, so this much is clear. Why not watch foreign media then? Or visit the European countries and see for themselves? Well, for most Russians, these options were never the case. 2020 census data reveals that less than 4% of the population speaks English. Only 29% of Russians hold an international passport, which actually allows them to travel abroad. And only 4% have ever had a European travel visa. So despite the geographic proximity, for most Russians and their families, integration with Europe is strained by how complex and expensive the process of acquiring a visa is. Since the start of the war, many European countries have stopped issuing tourist visas altogether, and the closest neighbours, Finland, Poland and the Baltic states, have shut their borders for those fleeing Putin's regime. With some exceptions, of course, such as Putin's very own goddaughter, Ksenia Sobchak, who, despite being on Navalny's list of war enablers, was granted free entry to Lithuania without a problem. But some Ivan from Moscow, running away from Putin's mobilization, will be turned over to Russian authorities in an instant. Maybe, if Europe was open not only to Russian gas, but also to its people, this war could have been avoided. Let's recap. Russian propaganda employs a multitude of techniques to present falsehoods as facts. At the same time, access to information is severely restricted. In the words of BBC correspondent Steve Rosenberg, Putin has actually constructed an alternative reality that many Russians have been living in since the beginning of the so-called special military operation. However, there is something much more powerful and damaging that affects almost everyone else: the true genius of Russian propaganda. Putin's super weapon is to hack the brains of the general public as if it were a DDoS attack. The fact is, Russian propaganda does not aim to provide a coherent, logical explanation of events. Instead, its goal is to inject alternative versions of events, no matter how contradictory, absurd, or delusional they are. These fake news are built on several principles. First, refuting a version can take longer than creating it. For instance, consider the flat Earth hypothesis. Could you prove right away that Earth is a sphere? And if so, how long would it take? Second, the discrepancy between different versions should lead the discussion into the very realm of fake news, where truth no longer exists. The main claim they want you to concede is that the truth is subjective, ambiguous, and contradictory. Third, the version should be convenient for the viewer. It should not evoke dissatisfaction or indignation, nor should it prompt protest. It should be easy to accept and allow the viewer to move past the issue. As a result, around half of the Russian population is aware that state propaganda is deceptive. However, they often perceive Western media just as untrustworthy, leading to the conclusion that everyone around is lying. Three most common phrases used to end the conversation about the ongoing war in Ukraine are: "We don't know the truth," "The situation is more nuanced than this," or "I'm simply not interested in politics." When a crime is committed by one's own country, this is how you might want to respond. To better understand the DDoS tactic of the Russian propaganda, let's consider three distinct events: the downing of the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, and a massacre in Bucha. On July 17, 2014, Russian-controlled separatists in eastern Ukraine shot down a civilian aircraft with a Russian Buk air defense system, resulting in the death of 298 people. Initially, it was suggested that a Ukrainian military transport plane, not a civilian aircraft, had been shot down. However, when it became clear that it was a Malaysian Boeing, Russian propaganda claimed that the plane had been shot down by a Ukrainian Su-25 fighter. This version was quickly dismissed, as the maximum flight altitude of the Su-25 is 3,000 meters, less than that of the MH17, and the falsification of images from space was also obvious. After this lie was proven false, it was then revealed that the plane had indeed been shot down by a surface-to-air missile. Another version suggested that Boeing had deviated from its course, entering the area of the Ukrainian air defense system, and being mistaken for the plane of the Russian president due to the similar color of the fuselage. The last version contradicted another version of the propaganda, which was distributed at the same time through a fake Twitter account of a Spanish dispatcher who allegedly saw Ukrainian military aircraft flying nearby. This raised the question, if the Ukrainian military was really to blame, how could they have mistaken their own military aircraft for the plane of the Russian president? At the same time, another version claimed that the plane had been blown up from the inside, and this was all a provocation by the CIA and the Dutch intelligence services. When Russian propaganda failed to blame Ukraine, they looked for ways to steer culpability away from the regime. They declared that such a missile was not in service with the Russian military, and that the village from where the shot was fired was under the control of the Ukrainian forces. When that didn't work either, they had to admit that it were the separatists that shot down the plane. Yet the speculations continued and new questions emerged, such as, can you name the specific perpetrators? Or the trials have not happened yet, have they? Or if the West had evidence, they would have published them long time ago. Of course, the usual, this was all seen as a secret operation of the special services of Ukraine to discredit Russia. In August 2020, the Russian Federal Security Service poisoned one of the Russian opposition leaders, Alexei Navalny. He was transported to Germany and received a life-saving treatment at Berlin's Charité clinic. At first, Russian propaganda denied the poisoning, claiming he had simply become ill. Various theories emerged, such as he had fallen into coma due to stress, excessive drinking, overwork, or skipping breakfast. So-called experts diagnosed him first with hypoglycemia and then with hyperglycemia. Yet independent labs in Europe confirmed that it was indeed a poisoning using a military-grade nerve agent. In the usual response, Russian propaganda blamed everyone but Putin and his security services. There were versions that Navalny had been poisoned by his associates, rivals, or even Western intelligence services. At the same time, theories emerged that the poisoning was staged and Navalny's blood test results were being intentionally concealed from the Russian authorities. At the end of March 2022, the Russian army left suburbs of Kiev. Shortly after, the Ukrainian journalists had reported emerging evidence of war crimes, including the executions of unarmed civilians in Bucha. Putin's propaganda machine sought to absolve the military of all responsibility for the incident. TV broadcasts declared that the events in Bucha were in fact staged. Propagandists tampered with video footage. A drop of dirt on car windshields was being passed off as a moving hand, and the curvature of a mirror was being used to suggest a lying corpse was an actor. Simultaneously, a version appeared that there were dummies on the road. The state propaganda began to question why reports about the massacre only began to surface on April the 4th, when the Russian army had actually left Bucha on March the 30th. They hinted that the corpses were victims of the city's cleansing by the Ukrainian army as retribution for cooperating with the Russians. And as always, this was a provocation by the West. Bucha and the English homonym butcher were being used interchangeably in the state media. So can we say that Russians have bought into the lies of the state propaganda? Yes, some certainly have, but the majority probably hasn't. Instead, they had more likely become cynical or apathetic, alienated by the endless contradictions between the narratives. People have taken refuge in phrases like, "We don't know the truth," and "everything is not as straightforward as it seems." This is much easier than listening to how evil your country is and having to accept that you can't change anything about it, that you are alone and powerless. This propaganda never aimed to give answers or explanations. Instead, it systematically diverts attention and discourse. It exhausts its opponent and absolves the state of responsibility. It is akin to a child lying to avoid blame for a broken vase. Now that you're familiar with Russian propaganda, you can predict the running narrative in all its deception. First response, nothing happened. Something happened? Well, the blame doesn't lie with Russia. Rather, it's with the victims themselves. The victims have nothing to do with it. Well, then it's an operation by the Western intelligence to slander Russia. The foreign intelligence has nothing to do with it, you might say. Okay, but you still won't prove anything, and we won't admit to anything either. Okay, so you proved something. But this is no longer a topical issue for the Russian society, so what difference does it really make? If you got tricked by my example at the start, or simply found this video educational, please consider leaving a like, sharing this video, and subscribing to our channel to learn more about Russia and how Putin's regime operates. Thank you for being with us, and see you next time.